This is the first of 4 lectures that will happen across the semester in the Shulman seminar. How many students are here in the Shulman seminar? Yeah, good, excellent. The Shulman seminar is one of 2 seminars that are given each year, sometimes each semester. The Frankie seminar is a parallel program, and these seminars are wonderful because they not only are undergraduate, advanced undergraduate seminars, but they bring in speakers from outside. The speakers not only give a public lecture, which we will hear in a few moments from the first of, but they also interact with in a class session with the seminar. They go to dinner afterwards downstairs, a catered dinner with the students in the seminar. It's a wonderful and perhaps exhausting day of interaction with the students. The Frankie seminar, the other parallel program, does the same thing. The Frankie seminar is on any topic in the humanities. The Shulman seminar, however, has a more specific focus in this. It is on a topic that covers somewhere near the edges of science and humanities. It is named after Robert Shulman. Robert Shulman is right here. Robert Shulman is Professor Emeritus in molecular biophysics and biochemistry, and a world-renowned expert in bioimaging. And I want to just recognize his presence. Thank you very much. I will admit to the fact that in order to get that molecular biophysics and biochemistry right, I was Googling him earlier this afternoon. I came across, when I typed in Robert Shulman, I came across a man by the name of Robert Yale Shulman, interestingly enough, a serial killer who was not the same as our Bob Shulman. Bob Shulman, by the way, was also, his picture is on the wall here, he was also a founding member. He's an extraordinary man whose interests extend across wide reaches, and he was a founding member of the Whitney Humanities Center. All right, that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over to John Durham Peters, who is the instructor of the Shulman seminar this semester, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Professor Shulman. Thank you all for coming. It's a total delight to see so many friends here. Dream of mine to see media scholars flourishing at Yale, so to see so many of you here makes me very happy. It's also a great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Paul Frosh, who's Professor of Communication at Hebrew University. He studied English at Cambridge with a PhD at Hebrew University. Like many of us, he started in language and literature. It's a natural move into media studies. He's the author of The Image Factory. Well, will you stand up and be my Carol Merrill, please? So The Image Factory of 2003, a book about stock photography. We have Media Witnessing, co-editor of a book called Media Witnessing, and hot off the press, The Poetics of Digital Media, which we recently discussed in class today. I was trying to think about how much our friendship, what carbon footprint our friendship has cost, because we've met in Prague, Helsinki, Jerusalem, San Juan, Boston, and now New Haven, which I feel very guilty about, but also very happy that such a person has crossed my path. Paul is exquisite at formal close reading, but also with larger ethical and political questions. And he's insistent these 2 things need not be opposed. He's got amazing gifts at reading and interpreting, including in counterintuitive ways. Read his piece on the selfie if you want to have all your expectations turned inside out. Indeed, his chapter in the recent book on the selfie ends with the words poetic justice. Many authors in media studies see media as a struggle for recognition and a fight to the death, to speak with Hegel. Paul Frosh, I think, sides with another thinker of the 18th century and gives us media studies as a theory of moral sentiments. Please join me in welcoming to Yale Professor Paul Frosh.
Good afternoon, if 5 o'clock really is afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to express my gratitude to John Peters for his hospitality, as well as for his intellectual and social generosity, and for inviting me to speak to you today, and also to speak to his students earlier about my work. I'd also really like to thank the students earlier for that discussion, for their lively, challenging, thought-provoking ideas and comments, and I've definitely got a lot to think through as I fly back home. My gratitude also goes to Boann for dealing with the logistics of my visit, and to the Whitney Center for hosting this afternoon's event. I should also say it's very gratifying to me. I think it's the first time actually in my career that I've spoken in a centre for the humanities, which is unusual for someone with a degree in English literature from Cambridge. But then I flipped over to communication studies and did an MA in communications and a PhD in communications in a social science department, social science faculty. And the divisions, even though many of the working processes and ideas moved across the faculty divisions quite easily, the bodies didn't follow across that move quite so easily. So it's really gratifying to be speaking at a Centre for the Humanities. The theme of this lecture series is elemental media. And in what follows, I hope to give you my take on what a concern with elemental media might involve. I will do so by presenting some arguments which I've been developing for a while and which have recently been given some expression in my book, The Poetics of Digital Media. And I'll also be taking them somewhat tentatively in a slightly new direction. This is the first outing for this new direction, and I am grateful for the opportunity to give it some kind of shape, though I will be the first to admit that it still needs sharpening. My lecture is prompted by two main ideas, or one main idea and an observation. The first main idea is that media are poetic forces, by which I mean that they produce and disclose worlds. They are poetic infrastructures, populating our life worlds with objects and beings to be encountered, including themselves. And they are also poetic performances, making available the worlds that they populate and their own character as media for recognition and reflection in moments of conspicuous disclosure. Parenthetically, I should say that my use of poetics owes more to Jakobson's idea of the poetic function of language as promoting the sensuous palpability of signs, and to Agamben's understanding of poesis as revelation and disclosure, of bringing forth, sometimes violently, into presence, and less to approaches that emphasize poetics as the study of the fundamental principles by which representational artifacts are constructed. In the contemporary era of mobile digital devices and networks, the poetic, world-producing and world-disclosing characteristics of media have been radically extended across social and material contexts, at micro, meso and macro scales of interaction, and have undergone intensification in their intervention and embedding in the spatial and temporal conditions of both ordinary and extraordinary human life. They have become a second nature. Our media technologies are so thoroughly interwoven into the fabric of everyday experience and into the multisensory, sensory motor and kinesthetic habits and rhythms of our bodies to the degree that they are fundamental frameworks for living and, in extreme situations, basic equipment for staying alive. While the metaphor of second nature was applied by Walter Benjamin and others to pre-digital technologies, the near omnipresent permeation of mobile and ambient digital devices into the smallest crevices of our everyday spaces, times, actions and interactions, a permeation that also links those crevices to global communication orders, make the attribution of second nature and the very character of that second nature both quantitatively and qualitatively distinctive from the analog era. Calling technological media second nature clearly casts them in elemental terms, as a technoculture which appears as a kind of nature, as a humanly manufactured artifice that is nevertheless an environment which we experience, if not as primordial, then as the given milieu for our existence, and to which we have adapted and are still adapting our bodies and minds. The paradox of the phrase second nature in this instant is not simply that artificial, humanly made culture comes in the guise of nature, or that it competes with nature, but that even then it can never be purely nature as such. The quotation marks around the term should not be removed, since, as John Peters says, nature is always nature through culture to us. This then is the first idea, digital media as a poetic second nature, producing and disclosing our hyper-mediated life worlds. I will expand on this idea in a moment, and it will form the bulk of the talk. The second idea, or probably observation, is that if digital media are experienced in elemental terms as second nature, then perhaps we can learn something important about their elemental status by attending to key metaphors that are applied to them in public and scholarly discourse. The metaphor I wish to explore briefly is saturation, a metaphor of infiltration and permeation to the point of fullness or even of excess, though also of other things, such as absorbency, plenitude, and intensity, which is frequently used to describe the sheer ubiquity of media technologies. I will suggest that this metaphor simultaneously uses the image of a natural force, principally liquid, to cast digital media as an anti-environment, drenching and drowning and inhospitable to human life, notwithstanding the vessels we have used to traverse it, and therefore not naturally fitted to human ends or dimensions, while at the same time, and unlike some other aqueous metaphors with which it is associated, enabling a consideration of media as powerful poetic condensers, intensifiers, and vessels of human and more than human existence. Hence the deliberate ambiguity of the title of this talk. The saturation of media can be taken to mean that media saturate the world, or that they are saturated by the world, thereby giving us new kinds of access to it. Just going to take a drink. So, to return to the first idea, I'll get rid of this quite ugly thing. So you can look at this. This image is just a screen saver. It's not relevant to anything. Well, it's quite poetic, possibly. I don't know. But anyway, it's just, if you want to know the photographer, it's Philippe Lorca de Corsia. Okay, back to the talk. So, to return to the first idea, that media produce and disclose worlds, that they are poetic infrastructures and poetic performances. To begin with, I should briefly indicate that I'm employing the idea, hardly new, that our conditions of existence as human beings coalesce in experience through the formation of worlds. The principal world is that of our ongoing, everyday, shared, sensate living in relationships, what phenomenological approaches have termed, with varying definitions, the life world. The world is already given, though dynamically so, to intersubjective experience, and which pre-structures all systematic or deliberate attempts to analyze or explore aspects of existence. Other worlds which overlap with the life world and can extend from and into it include perceptual and symbolic worlds which are overtly imagined, such as fiction, and those which are beyond the possibilities of direct perception, but which are presented or inferred as actual, e.g. the microscopic entities and environments and macroscopic astrophysical systems which science visualizes, as well as the cosmologies of mythic and religious cultures. Worlds are imbued with ontological density and complexity. They are understood to be populated by beings and objects, but are not reducible to those beings and objects, which in turn are not reducible to the media or symbol systems by which they are perceived. Worlds possess a capaciousness that enables a sense of dwelling within them. The world that we, the inhabitants of the post-industrial global north, experience as given, as our primary habitat, is, as I have suggested, thoroughly technologized. While the ability to create, shape, and disclose worlds is a characteristic of technological media broadly conceived across historical periods, the poetics of contemporary media are different in degree, if not also in kind, from the contexts that preceded them. Among other things, we habitually depend on media for constant, unnoticed reassurance that the world out there exists. This reassurance is provided both by the continual arrival of the representations of the larger world and our habitual, unremarkable exposure to media's signs of their own smooth functioning as connective systems, such as the tiny symbols on our computer and smartphone interfaces indicating connection to wireless internet or cellular networks. Indicators that I will argue are not simply technical indicators of efficient functioning, but actual signs of life itself, or vital signs. Following Barth, we might call these perceptionally marginal, yet operationally perpetual indications of smooth functioning, the rustle of media, the barely noticed background sound of happy machines, the noise of what is working well. More to the point, media construct and disclose worlds, much of whose content is media themselves. Media observe themselves, make themselves the object of attention and discourse, as a culturally constructed second nature imbricated within everyday existence. The idea that media have become ever more deeply embedded and intertwined with our lives in the world, to the point that they constitute a technocultural environment which is increasingly difficult to disentangle from a set of primary, putatively direct or unmediated situations, is a key theme of debates in communication and media studies around what is often called the mediation of everything, or the concept of mediatization. One concept that I have found useful in this discussion is Couldry and Hepp's metaphor of what they call the media manifold. Couldry and Hepp use the manifold metaphor because in topology, according to them, it describes the adequate representation of multiple dimensions in a form of fewer dimensions. For them, this is analogous to the situation of typical social actors in rich countries, for whom, on the one hand, the possibilities of communication and information resources are almost infinite, this is their term, but who, on the other hand, are usually only presented with a reduced set of communicative options in everyday life. Couldry and Hepp, I should note, are mainly interested in the implications of this reduction for social order and political power. However, this idea of the media manifold is also significant for a poetics of media. It allows us to think about how media make worlds present within an already mediated world, life world. How does the experiential givenness of the life world, in and through media, operate across these two levels of the media manifold, the reduced and the potential? How is the expansively mediated life world given presence within the small worlds of users, which themselves are part of the imagined totality of media possibilities that the term manifold includes? To use a slightly different terminology, how are contemporary media worlds implicated in relations of immanence, media devices, practices, objects, texts embedded in our everyday life worlds, and transcendence, our life worlds extended beyond their everyday horizons through media devices, practices, objects, and texts? We can describe media's poetic relations as manifold in two complementary ways. First, media do the poetic world of world presencing and world disclosure by multiply enfolding worlds within other worlds, hence manifold. They embed worlds within one another and populate our private and shared spaces with individuals and objects from other worlds, making them immanent to everyday experience, while at the same time enabling the extension and transcendence of experiential boundaries. This enfolding can strangely warp the relationship between macrocosm and microcosm, and between interior and exterior, as I will go on to show a little later on. Such multiple enfoldings of worlds within worlds is a fundamental attribute of the everyday, largely overlooked work of media as poetic infrastructures. Hence, the second poetic process associated with the manifold is to make manifest those enfolded worlds, and the very processes of embedding and populating that media routinely implement, through acts of disclosure and performances of unfolding. Broadly speaking then, media operate in a double relation to the life world and its multifarious extensions, enfoldings and incorporations. Media shape their ongoing, largely taken for granted modes of being present by virtue of their connective, perceptual and symbolic attributes. And they make their modes of presence perceivable, available for recognition and reflexive exploration in occasionally extreme moments of overt recognition. Media are thus involved in constructing the experiential givenness of existentially intertwined worlds, and of enabling their revelation through representation and tangibility. The given world is given through media. Probably the best way to clarify and elaborate everything that I've said so far is by offering a close reading of a particular media text. I'm now going to show, it'll also provide a bit of light relief. I'm now going to show a very short video, only 3.5 minutes long. It's part of a series made by Disney of their own movies called As Told By Emoji. And all of these movies are available on YouTube. In this series, Disney retells their classic films as though they are occurring on a smartphone, with the principal characters played by emojis communicating with one another via various mobile interfaces and applications. So we are now going to watch Beauty and the Beast, as told by emoji. I hope you're familiar with the story. Okay. I heard quite a lot of people laughing, so hopefully you enjoyed that bit. That's the end of the jokes, guys. Okay, so it's of course easy to dismiss this video as unserious, mere entertainment, flim-flam, designed to further enhance and promote the Disney brand and its products, and none of that I would deny. Well, I would actually deny that it's unserious, but I wouldn't deny that it's designed to promote Disney's products. But I also think it's worth treating it as a highly intelligent and very succinct commentary on contemporary media culture. I think that it's an extraordinarily rich text which makes visible in concentrated form key attributes of the world-producing and world-disclosing character of digital media that I've already described, and also of the way media are enfolded into and also fall across our lives. Let's unpack this by moving across the text thematically. The first theme concerns the populating and production of worlds. The video presents mobile screens as worlds populated by emojis. Emojis, which we have mainly become familiar with through text-based digital communication, are depicted as pictographic symbols through which characters, actions, emotions, spaces and times are embodied and expressed. Yet they are also presented here as animated entities who can traverse diverse device applications, moving in and out of games, videos and different screen interfaces. They are depicted as transmedial beings, and they seem to be at home everywhere on the screen, understood as an environment. However, one of the first questions a narrative analysis of the video would raise is, who is speaking here? Drawing on Goffman's tripartite typology of speaker roles, we could designate the Disney Corporation as what he calls the principal, the party responsible for producing the message. Also, following Goffman, it makes sense to designate the video's accredited production team in the role he calls author, in that they have created the script and designed the content of the film, though this role could also be co-assigned to the Disney Corporation. Yet it is less clear who is positioned for viewers as the one telling them the story, enunciating the utterance. Of course, the video title itself, provides a possible answer to the question of who this enunciator might be. As told by emoji. The ambiguity of the construction by emoji, potentially meaning either told via emojis as a pictographic symbol system or told by an entity called emoji. Very serendipitously, given the status of the video as an animated text, this enunciative and narrational function is called by Goffman the animator. Emoji is therefore not just an animated form, but a potential animating narrative agent, a collective personage who begins the video in the pre-credit shot with a sequence of pulsating dots in a speech bubble signifying someone is typing, followed by a text that declares once upon a time. As the possible enunciator and animator of the entire video text then, emojis take on a creative and expressive life of their own, not only moving within and across the various applications and interfaces represented within the device world of the smartphone, but also taking us out and outside the frame of the mobile device to show it to us from the outside. The video populates the smartphone world, but also potentially other worlds that overlap with and enframe the smartphone with a new quasi-autonomous animate being. The second theme concerns the presentation of the screen world as a seemingly enclosed system that parallels both the fairy tale story world and the digitized social life worlds of viewers. The film's humor is based largely on the provision of parodic digital equivalents to diegetic elements in the fairy tale. The equivalent for space is the vertically oriented screen of the smartphone, which, it is worth noting, also constitutes a gravitational field. The rose petal falls downwards. Time is represented by the chronological ordering of speech bubbles from top to bottom, which is the usual direction of scrolling on social media apps, but also by the already mentioned pulsating dots, indicating both that time is passing and that something is about to be said or appear. For instance, each wolf in the chase sequence is preceded by these dots. Other equivalents are more obvious and even funnier. The castle as a property offered for rental on Airbnb. The castle library as a digital archive of virtual shelves modelled on Apple Books, where only the titles shown just happen to be Disney films. The magic mirror as an app called Enchanted Mirror Time, which is based on Apple's FaceTime. The roar of the beast as a sound file spelt R-A-W-R, and later whelp. The battle between the beast and the angry villagers as a version of the game Angry Birds. All of these equivalents, in addition to their humorous effects, create analogies between smartphone technologies and the enchanted world of fairy tale. This frequently makes the enchantment banal. The magic mirror as FaceTime is my particular favourite. But it also makes manifest the capacities of media as forms of world enchantment. In particular, their possibilities for enabling action at a distance, often figured in older literary works as the prerogative of magic. Perhaps the crucial point is that while the media has a clear parodic dimension, aimed both at the fairy tale world and the smartphone world, their very conjunction and analogy discloses the smartphone world as an environment whose defining characteristic is that it is replete with a vast range of overt mediating possibilities, some of which, like media technologies in the past, assume the guise of magic. Additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, the amusing incongruity of apps such as Airbnb and FaceTime, featuring in the fairy tale narrative, appear not just as background elements, but as drivers of plot and action, drawing attention to the broader social and existential agency of the applications depicted. It reminds us that the smartphone world is not self-enclosed at all, that it is not confined to the device, but is radically distributed across and embedded within physical and social sites in the extended life world of users. The third theme is an extension of the second. The video presents its worlds as embedded in and enfolded within other worlds, occasionally in ways that strangely warp microcosm and macrocosm, internal and external, legend and life. The smartphone screen is the ground of virtually all of the action, and the video begins with a close-up of the bottom of the screen so that one cannot see its edges. Much of the video is filmed in this fashion. The edges of the video frame are either coextensive with or narrower than the screen of the depicted smartphone. However, there are important moments when we are shown the smartphone in its entirety, facing the viewer, standing upright on a wooden table covered with old-style leather-bound books in a fairy tale landscape of forests, mountains, and a castle. This mise-en-scène of the video's enframing world suggests that the smartphone itself exists within an overarching world of legend and folktale, and is ready for use by a larger, full-sized, non-emoji Beauty or Beast. In fact, it suggests that it is the world of Beauty and Beast, the movie, which enframes and contains the smartphone. A smartphone which is now, as we watch, telling the story of Beauty the Beast, the movie, in miniaturized emoji form. To complicate matters, in addition to this implication that the movie Beauty and the Beast is the video's broadest enframing world, a segment of the original movie, the dance sequence in the ballroom, actually appears at one stage on the smartphone, and the emojis of Beauty and the Beast jump into it and begin to dance. This implication and extraction of worlds beyond worlds, of the movie world as the container of the device world of the story, along with the movie as a world enfolded within the smartphone world that it contains, again makes visible a powerful characteristic of contemporary digital existence. This is the complex multiple enfolding of worlds within other worlds in intense interpermeation at multiple scales of social and physical life, a characteristic that I mentioned earlier under the rubric of the media manifold. If we add one more potential layer to this manifold, an actual viewer such as me or you watching the movie on the screen of their smartphone, we can appreciate even further how deeply multidimensional the manifold can become, and how cleverly it can be made manifest for us through media themselves. The last theme I want to note is perhaps the most striking of all. This is the rendering of life itself and of its transformation as a media function. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the idea of vital signs, that in a society where mobile digital devices and networks have created a default condition of perpetual contactability, indicators of media functioning have also taken on new meanings and urgency as signs of life. The video shows this metaphorically, and we can of course build here on the older idea of animation, not simply as a technical cinematic process, but as the imbuing of spirit and soul to seemingly inert matter. The metaphor is clearest in the equivalence between battery life and organic life. brilliantly encapsulated by the use of the rose as an interface icon displaying the smartphone's remaining power. The life of the beast is identical to the life of the device and its world. The second instantiation of this theme is in the final resurrection of the beast as an upgrade in the operating system, again completely identifying the life of the character with the life of the world he inhabits, and drawing a parallel between the magical transformative power of love and the transformative power of technology. Given the parodic tenor of much of the video, I interpret this equivalence as being at the expense of the incessant and aggressive promotion of pseudo-novelty and upgrades by software corporations and its attendant cultural condition, in Wendy Chun's words, of upgrading to remain the same. The resemblance to the Apple logo and Apple iOS update screen seems to make Apple the butt of this joke. But again, beyond the critical potential in a video made by Disney, there is also an important point about digital existence revealed by this equivalence. Sometimes battery life is equivalent to life itself. For instance, if you need to be rescued from imminent danger, and the use of the rose as a battery life indicator is a dramatization of a digitized vital sign. We should perhaps then replace the hyphen between the words battery and life with an equals sign. Battery equals life. In my book, I give an example of the last WhatsApp messages sent by a worried mother to her soldier daughter, who, it later turns out, could not respond because she was no longer alive. The WhatsApp interface showed the non-receipt of the messages and the absence of the daughter from the application on the mother's screen. But we all know situations where we have not heard from our loved ones, our partners or our children, and we text and phone to no avail and also cannot tell when they were last seen, as the wording goes, on WhatsApp. This is the vital sign we are waiting for, a sign that is vital in that it indicates life, but it is also vital in a way that our organs are vital, are crucial to our psychological, if not our physical, existence. Again, this existential nervousness about the non-responsiveness of others is not new to digital times. Sitting by a landline phone, I don't know how many of you remember those, waiting for it to ring, simply to know if a loved one was safe, performed a characteristic anxiety of pre-digital modernity. And it is probably true to say that our disconnection anxieties move as far and as fast as our connective technologies themselves will take us. What is different, however, is that today our connectivity is near constant, a default setting of our lives, as many teachers and lecturers know from their classrooms. And integral to that setting is the fact that we almost always carry these devices around with us, including to private spaces such as the bathroom. They are close to our bodies, frequently in direct, sensuously experienced contact with clothing or skin. The absence or presence of vital signs is thus an embodied and multi-sensuous experience, registered not just through interruptive notifications on our screens, but by sound vibrations in the air and tactile physical vibrations against our bodies. Our disposition of possible alertness to such signs is not simply a matter of conscious expectation, but one of actual bodily adjustment and configuration. Not just the constant fidgeting with our computers and smartphones, which many of us find difficult not to perform in their presence, but even the experience of phantom vibration syndrome, where we imagine vibrations and other alerts from our phones which have not occurred. Our digital devices now provide, perhaps impose is a more appropriate word, what we could call constant connectivity at the level of the hair trigger and the nerve ending. In these circumstances, whether one or one's beloved has battery life becomes an existential concern distilled to the most minute sensations of our bodies as they are continually attuned to an all-enveloping media manifold. I've used this close reading of the video to elaborate and concretize ideas about media as world-producing and world-disclosing forces, particularly in conditions of hypermediation where media are experienced as second nature. I want now to briefly ask a further question. If media are experienced in such an elemental fashion as to seem like nature, what can be learned from the use of elemental metaphors to describe them in popular and academic discourse? This interest follows directly on from my explication of the Poetics of Digital Media in two ways. First, because it understands metaphor as a force for traversing and mutually unfolding worlds, as a mode of world-making and of world disclosure. And second, because by emphasizing poetics as a mode of disclosure, it takes issue with one of the core elemental metaphors often used to describe the environmental dimensions of media. The key image I'm referring to was, as John Peters points out, popularized by McLuhan but did not originate with him, that the fish cannot experience water as its environment because it has no anti-environment with which to contrast it and therefore perceive it as water. However, one of the things that our elemental and other metaphors for media do, along with the rich reflexive texts like the one we have just seen, is make visible and palpable the environmental dimensions of media, in part through foregrounding incongruities and also potential hostilities. Our use of metaphors and images enables us to imagine and experience media as if they were an anti-environment. The term saturation is one of a family of many semi-aqueous metaphors applied to our contemporary media environment. Our society, we are frequently told, is saturated by media in general, or by cameras, or by screens, or by images. Nick Couldry, usually a very considered theorist, has even expanded on this rhetoric, somehow finding the term saturation insufficient. We live, he says, in an age where everyday life has become super-saturated with media flows. In short, a cynic could claim that the metaphor of saturation has definitely reached saturation point. This use of saturation, which I admit I may have employed myself in the past, accompanies a series of other watery epithets: the flood of images, the deluge of texts, even, according to Todd Gitlin, the torrent of media. Most recently, I've been reading on photography sites about the tsunami of images on social media. It is, of course, not merely media abundance that is signalled by these terms, but their overwhelming force, the biblical portentousness of their cataclysmic proportions, and their hostility to human existence as a physical creature principally adapted to life on land. Usually, when employing these metaphors, the speaker is mainly describing the sheer ubiquity of media technologies and media artifacts, turning this quantitative pervasiveness into a qualitative threat by suggesting that media, as a watery element with tidal force, will quite simply drown us. Saturation, however, while definitely associated with these more apocalyptic terms, and certainly used frequently as a synonym for media ubiquity, is nevertheless subtly but significantly different. To begin with, the etymology of the verb saturate does not begin with water or liquid or with being overwhelmed, but, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, with the Latin saturare, which means full or satiated. The earliest meanings of the word in English retain and emphasize this sense, where to be saturated means to have reached a state of satisfaction and fullness, a state perhaps teetering on the border of excess, but not there yet. Only one of the 6 main different meanings offered by the Oxford English Dictionary refers to the state of being soaked or thoroughly impregnated, and many of the metaphorical examples given are positive, such as, quote, having one's mind saturated by the Gospels. In fact, the examples in which saturation is clearly used to denote an overwhelming and excessive presence or force come only from the 2 most modern usages, both from the 1940s and 50s. One is the economic saturation of markets by a surfeit of products. The other is saturation bombing. Given these meanings, I would venture to say that saturation is actually a very interesting and useful way to think about media as elemental, as long as we pay attention to its metaphorical fecundity and semantic range. This is because it invites us to think seriously about what might be the appropriate boundary states to a mediated environment. What I mean by the boundary states is how we answer the question, what and when is too much media? What is a surfeit of media, and how does this impinge on experience? If we accept, with many other thinkers, that humans are characterized by adaptability to their environment and that we co-evolve with the technologies we produce, it is likely that our boundary states may be reasonably, perhaps radically flexible, no doubt up to a particular physical and neurological limitations. For instance, while we decry shifts in attention and in attentiveness seemingly caused by contemporary media and a culture of distraction, shifts that some see as detrimental to the intellectual powers of a whole generation of youth, that culture is also continually producing cognitively demanding and intensely immersive expressive forms with which people of all ages engage. Just look at the renaissance that is contemporary television drama, for instance. as well as extremely rich short forms such as the emoji video we saw earlier. Boundary states are also visible according to domains of action and power. We may accept and even welcome media saturation in its sense of fullness or satisfaction in the increasing availability of a much wider range of cultural objects and experiences online than ever before. But we may feel that the point of saturation has been well passed in the presence and activity of media that gather and distribute information about us to others without our awareness or consent. Hence, saturation is a useful metaphor, not for simple media ubiquity, but for the complex boundary work required in our experiential, cultural and political relations with the presence of media across more and more contexts of our life worlds. Additionally, and perhaps more poetically, saturation is useful for thinking what might constitute the material, sensory and symbolic substance of a mediated environment. What I mean by this is that the metaphor of saturation as pervading and permeating to the point of fullness suggests something of the novel interstitial character of contemporary digital media. I use the term interstitial because, like the liquid that saturates a piece of cloth, media have come to occupy new spaces and new temporalities, both in everyday experience and in social structures that they were previously unable to occupy or unable to occupy quite as extensively. This occurs on the level of everyday temporal experience, where live interpersonal conversation and representation at a distance can now be performed consecutively with other tasks, such as sitting in a lecture or watching television. Indeed, where television can now be watched anywhere and at any time, and the same applies to video. Latour famously asked, "Where are the missing masses?" arguing that objects have been ignored by sociology as actants filling dimensions of social relations, space and time. I would argue that media in particular have become preeminently good at filling social dimensions that were previously thought to be relatively empty. This idea of interstitial saturation also applies in a technical and perceptual or sensory sense. Our bodies are increasingly occupied with media than in the past. They fill, perhaps saturate, our ears with sound through headphones. They fill our eyes with increasingly fine-grained images on screens with ever higher resolutions, faster refresh rates and sharper colours. And they occupy our hands at speeds and with operative gestures, click, swipe, press, stretch, scroll, type, that are performed with astonishing dexterity, well, at least by some of us. Again, the question of how our world is saturated in its substance is made available for reflection in media itself, as is the question of to what extent the substances and boundaries of our lives should be opened up at all scales, from the macrostructural to the microsensory, to the technologies that both populate our lives and disclose our conditions of existence. There are two final points to make. The saturation is not simply a metaphor for ubiquity, but also for intensity. The basis for this metaphor is not liquid, but colour and light. In technical terms, the saturation of a colour refers to its light intensity. Using few wavelengths of light produces more intense and saturated colour. Applying this metaphor in relation to media invites us to think less about how media saturate our world, but about how they might be saturated by the world. How can a medium be saturated by the world? First, it must be receptive to the world as a kind of vessel or receptacle, open to the registration of the world's plenitude and unexpectedness. Much of media use is instrumental and highly formalized, pre-anticipating how the world should be represented or communicated in particular ways. And no medium can be infinitely open to the vagaries and fullness of experience. Yet some uses of some media suggest possibilities whereby receptiveness of saturation can be achieved. Most obviously, this is the case with photography, with theorists making claims that, in the words of Kaja Silverman, photography is the world's primary way of demonstrating to us that it exists and that it will forever exceed us. This notion of media as a receptacle for saturation is complicated by the claim, again in photography theory, that the image returns its receptivity to us in the form of an intensity, a sharp, poignant, punctuating, concentrated return of the real, which Barthes calls the punctum. So two forms of saturation can be thought in relation to media as saturated by the world: receptivity and intensity, along with the potential richness of saturation as interstitial and adaptive involvement in the world, I would venture to say that this metaphorical thinking about media enables us as cultural scholars to make ourselves full, perhaps to the point of excess, and receptive to media. Hopefully, our discourse will enable to return some of media's potential intensities to our publics. Thank you very much.
Can you just close the laptop? And
Sure.
access, right? Okay. You're happy to take questions. Right? I will
Yeah.
happily direct question track. Yes, please.
In terms of the ways in which you use saturation, now there is such a resurgence of the concept of mindfulness, not just for Buddhists or Zen Buddhists, but just because of intense stress, which is partially caused by all the media saturation and tsunami. So mindfulness is cropping up everywhere, and the whole point of it is to just sit with yourself.
Right.
And how do you feel that how can you, do you feel that is a remedy to the saturation?
It may very well be for some people. I haven't really thought about mindfulness, and I don't know a lot about it as either an intellectual or a social or moral movement. And in Israel, no one is really mindful, to generalize greatly. They're argumentative and there are plenty of other things, but I'm not sure that. I mean, no, that's not true. There is there's a lot of mindfulness in certain areas. But it does strike me that your question is about an attempt to. Mindfulness does not use media; it attempts to move away from media and engagement with media. As far as I can tell from what you just said.
There are apps for it now.
Sorry. Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because I mean, for example, I'll just give you another example. It doesn't strike me as mindfulness, but there is a lot of there are genres on YouTube of videos which are based around repeated sensory and sensory motor features, where the content, and in particular, for example, there's ASMR, where people make gentle scraping noises and other kinds of noises into microphones, which has a kind of, some would say hypnotic, others would say intensely irritating effect on viewers. But the point of the video is to generate a kind of, well, I suppose to use another very trendy word, affect, which responds, which allows one, I suppose, to move above or beyond other forms of sensory engagement with media by virtue of engaging with the videos themselves. So that's the closest I can get to answering the question in terms of mindfulness. I mean, it does strike me also possibly as a movement, a reaction. And there are, in the history of media, there have been constant reactions against the spread and increasing intensification of media from a whole variety of social groups, whether that's through emphasizing personal bodily modes of producing dispositions which resist media, to simply unplugging media or refusing.
So in Israel, on the Sabbath day, those who are going to observe it, no media.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what's the first thing that is done by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox people as soon as the Sabbath goes out? They turn on their phones. It's the first thing. There are two lights which commemorate, which indicate the end of the Sabbath. The first light is the candle, and the second light is the cell phone. In other words, that's not about mindfulness. There is a certain mindfulness enabled, but the intensity of anticipation for that connectivity, and for ultra-Orthodox people, it's very limited connectivity because they only use what are known as kosher phones, is quite phenomenal. So I'd be interested to see whether there isn't a kind of similar dialectic with mindfulness, that you do your mindfulness exercises and then you go back on Facebook. But I don't know. So. Yep.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that media started occupying where they could not occupy in the past. So is this phenomenon of media saturation something historically contingent?
historically contingent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's historically determined. I don't think anyone necessarily planned it. And I don't think that there was I don't think there's a necessary progression from less to more saturating media. What are the historical forces that produce it? Well, the infrastructures for wireless communication. And there are lots along the way. There are lots of decisions that aren't obvious. Infrastructures for wireless communication, miniaturization. There are a whole load of forces creating the possibilities for this kind of saturation. And there are also, limiting factors. And at a certain point, we may find out that although I don't address environmental issues, that the environment is going to be an availability of certain kinds of metals and other resources to use in these infrastructures is going to be a limiting factor on how they develop. So is it historically contingent? Absolutely. Is it new? I think it is qualitatively and quantitatively new for the reasons I've given. You could understand it as historically connected to or continuing certain kinds of development that were long commentated on in earlier eras of modernity. The increasing nervousness of modern life, the increasing alertness of certain institutional centres, the newsroom as a centre of social alertness, which also extends to, for example, the emergency room or the police centre or the military room, increasing centres increasing areas of the political and social infrastructure, which have to continually monitor and respond to, as quickly as possible, emerging developments in society at large. What's interesting is that has now devolved increasingly onto the individual as well, both as censors of these greater institutions. So as I said to the students before, we have become journalists embedded potentially in our own lives through mobile devices and through the actual physical embodied relations we have with these media technologies, which demand a kind of embodied disposition or physical poise of alertness. We read, we use our computers, and we scroll through our mobile devices as though constantly ready for the next operation that we can perform. And we're constantly interrupted on those devices by other messages telling us about new things that we can and should perform. We're constantly made into nodes for receiving and passing on information. Francesco Cassetti has written wonderfully about how the screens themselves have become like bus stations to a certain degree, with information and images passing across them or through them. And those screens are on our persons. And as I said before, they're screens which are also multi-sensuously connected to us and ready to alert us, whether it's my wife in trouble or the fact that I need to update the operating system. And I can't initially tell the difference between those different kinds of vibrations. So I think that it is qualitatively different. But it wasn't necessarily always going to be that way. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that there won't be movements like mindfulness, increasing controls imposed, among other people, by governments and states to control media use, bankruptcies or the fall of great media giants. All of these things are possible. So it's not necessarily going to become more saturated. But we have, and the other thing about saturation, of course, is it's always on the point of being, saturation is about fullness, not necessarily about excess. And that fullness is relative. It can shift historically and contingently. So what my generation may experience as a surfeit, as too much, as an excess, my children may experience as replete, as full, as enabling and empowering some of the time, and also worrying and anxious other parts. But it may be a very different approach to what is too much or enough media, because as I said, saturation is not necessarily about excess. That was a very long answer to a very short question. Yeah.
Francesco, please.
Thank you. Absolutely great. I go back to the first part of your talk about the idea of multifold. So put simple way. Multifold, of course, is the virtuality, the potentiality, Deleuze, of course, and the image crystal. There is a lot of things. But basically, if I think today, it's on one side the fullness of the shelves in a mall, or the moral choice I have to do between A, B, C, that are all choices, may be good. So the multifold may be exactly more things I can enjoy, or a choice I'm called to do. You wrote a fantastic text on the moral choice and moral responsibility, and it's one of your topics. May you articulate better the way in which the multi-fold today may be one thing or the other. Anyway, about the multifold, I recommend you the last Spider-Man.
Yes,
movie,
I haven't seen it. I heard it's
which
wonderful.
is absolutely great.
Yeah.
But exactly the question and the enjoyment is where I have to be.
Yeah.
And this is a moral choice.
Yeah. Well, this is a really important and difficult question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I think that there is a historical challenge posed by our digital devices and what we've called the multifold or manifold. And that is that they enable possibilities which in the past were not there. So it is the case that while I am on Amazon shopping virtually in the mall through my Amazon app, I can also be making moral choices about whether I should be signing online petitions, whether I should be forwarding distressing news to other people, whether I should be resisting or publicizing private information I have somehow acquired to those with whom I'm connected, and also whether I should disconnect publicly and very clearly from people with whom I violently disagree. All of those choices have been made available by this new media manifold. In other words, and they've been made available on a very intimate and perpetual basis. There is no end to the number of things I can buy on Amazon if I want to, given the money. And there is also no end to the number of online petitions I could probably sign. And as quickly as I sign one petition or forward one video, another one will emerge for me to engage with. So it actually means that the question of, I wrote a piece in the beginning of my book starts off with the idea of pre-digital media producing a moral environment of indifference, which is morally enabling. We do not have to engage with the other. I don't think that's true in the same way with digital media. I think that we're constantly faced with the choice of do I or do I not forward, swipe, search, and what else am I doing at the same time? Precisely, and the criticism that it's slacktivism gets the point but gets the point wrong. Slacktivism criticizes online petitions, etc., because it says, in part, they do not involve enough effort. That's precisely the moral challenge that I see. Because they do not involve effort, we can do them effortlessly, which means that we should be doing them as frequently and as often as possible. And then how do you make those choices? So that's putting the manifold or the multifold in moral terms. And that's it. Yeah.
There's another question.
No, go ahead. You're the first hand.
It's very interesting. Your response. I don't want this to be misunderstood as a plus ça change, plus ça la même chose sort of question. Your response a moment ago to the question about historicization, whereby the next generation could look at repleteness, could feel replete, whereas we feel superabundant, or suggests a deeper historicization that could be recursive.
Yeah.
The history of technology, and in a sense the history of mediatization of the world in response to a niche, is at least 10 times, and probably a lot longer than 10 times as old as the species Homo sapiens in the first place. So I'm wondering, yes, the condition is different now, but the condition is always experienced as different.
but it is always about niche construction, and it is always about a mediatized niche construction, as long as there has been a technologized relationship to the environment. And I'm wondering whether there is a theorization in your work that can encompass that distance, or whether the theorization really is localized in a moment of the last 100 years or whatever.
So what do you mean in niche construction?
I mean the fact that we as organisms are busy building our environment, and always have been busy building our environment. The environment changes as we change, and the environment then, in a feedback way, is changing us. That building of the environment has always been a technological one, as long as our species has existed, and that technology has been changing precisely in its media relations to that place us in relation to the world, and so. Where is the theoretical distinction between
I suppose the theoretical distinction, and here I would work with people like Cordry and Hepp in their argument, and they argue basically that there is a big historical distinction being made, and they don't just talk about the last 100 years. They don't talk in spans of millions or thousands of years, but they're certainly talking about several hundred, at least since the invention of print, if not before. And their argument is that the intense interconnectedness of contemporary social, economic, political and cultural life, enabled and perhaps imposed by contemporary media, is not simply a matter of quantitative increase. It makes a qualitative difference. It imposes loads and judgments and possibilities and possibilities which did not previously exist. It exposes to view forms of social organisation which previously did exist, but they weren't viewable, and their very visibility itself makes a difference. Classic example is friendship. Okay, now it may be the case that Facebook calling every one of its contacts friends in itself won't make a big difference, but it could be. Again, time will tell. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a blink of an eye in terms of in longer historical perspectives. It may be that the visibility of the people I know, and the people they know, and the people they know, to one another, and the fact that we can check the people we know and the people that they know in relation to one another before making a commitment, does change a basic form of social interaction. And that would be, for example, one of their arguments, and I would subscribe to that it is possible to say that this is not simply a matter of quantitative increase which will recursively create a form of adaptation. There is an actual significant qualitative change going on here, to which we may adapt. We may become more calculative. We may react and become more mindful and say we're having nothing to do with it. But it is a qualitative change. So whether that's a qualitative change across the whole history of the human species, well, I would venture to say it probably is. I think it's certainly a qualitative change if we think about the last 500 years. So yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask whether you feel that the saturation is something that's subjective, and then I think you spoke to that with the generational divide.
I think it's intersubjective. What do I mean by that? We'll all feel it, or we'll all be able to dispute it, but it's already become a term of discourse. I don't know. You guys are students, and I don't know how John or Francesco or others give us. I constantly get essays from students, and I read academics and also the public press, who talk about in our media-saturated age. And it's become almost a dead metaphor, in a way. And what I'm trying to do it here, I suppose, is to reanimate it or revitalise it. So I think there is a sense that, I mean, again, part of it is we do have to worry, this draws on the previous question, you do have to be a little bit concerned about presentism, which is the idea that everything now is different and everything now is new. And there are certainly great continuities, both with previous media and with previous historical and cultural formations. But there is clearly concern about that we are in a period of surfeit. And I think that thinking about that, the idea of saturation can take us away from worrying merely about surfeit and thinking about what the shape of the interaction between media and ourselves and our social frameworks could be. That's why I talked about this interstitial relationship. But anyway, so it's not simply subjective. I think it's a discursive framework for thinking about media and culture today. Yeah.
You
you mentioned McLuhan's like metaphor of the fish in water. So I'm wondering how, like, I feel like someone who grew up when smartphones were still like, relatively new. So I kind of distinguish between the virtual world and the like my life world. How do you feel like the generation that grew up, you know, in the midst of that will they make that distinction, or is the virtual world for them just as like elemental as like what we would think of as more like?
What are you talking about? You're talking about people who are younger than you?
Yeah, people.
Because you look really young to me.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose people who maybe like grew up when smartphones were available to them at a very young age. Like,
Well, I think we also have to take into account the increasing thematization of the distinction between, not the increasing, the continual thematization of the distinction between virtual and real within popular culture. So I think that firstly, in terms of cultural discourse and cultural forms, the questions of what is real, what is mediated, what is the relationship between the real and the mediated, what is the relationship between my life and what I see or read on various media, is constantly raised within media themselves, whether it's popular entertainment or whether it's articles or programs or controversies and scandals. So that's the first. So I'm not sure that younger people, I don't know how old you are, but let's say 16 or 17-year-olds, would not be aware of that distinction. And I listen, you know, again, the advantages of being old is that I remember my mother telling me not to jump out of the window like Superman, okay, because I couldn't fly. And where was I going to see Superman? On television. There's a long history of, I mean, we talked about it in class before, of media panics and also of iconoclastic approaches to certain kinds of visual media, which suggests that they are going to be the root of certain kinds of fantasy or evil, where people can't tell the difference between the real and the other. Sorry?
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote. I mean, exactly. So it's not a new concern. I think, I mean, there is an argument put forward by some academics that certain media, which in certain contexts, for example, photography, were treated as evidential, have now, as a matter of course, that your first response to a photograph was to think it is evidence, and then possibly to suspect it, that has now been reversed. That given the proliferation of digital media technologies, which we can all use. Sorry? Sorry?
This is from a yearbook in 1984.
Exactly. So, no, but that's become prevalent. That the argument is now that the prevalent approach to photographs is that they are to be suspected first, and only once proven. By the way, this was for a long time the approach of the law courts, of course, was that they were not to be taken at face value, but that they are to be suspected first and then only taken at face value if they can be in some way reinforced. What's interesting about that, and I talk about this in the book, is that a lot of the innocence, I suppose, institutionally and rhetorically created about photographs has been transferred to a particular kind of digital object, which we call the screenshot, which is often used as evidence in digital arenas, not in all digital areas, but certainly in journalism. You all know Trump's tweets through screenshots, and no one has ever thought that they may have been manipulated. But they're digital images, they're easily manipulable. In other words, the screenshot has inherited approaches to it that come from an earlier era, possibly of photography. So, but to go back to your question, the virtuality, reality thing, it's not new, and it's continually raised within media. I mean, I can think of a dozen films, not a dozen, but a handful of films, certainly from the last few years, which talk about it. And anyone watching Black Mirror, you know, so you know what I'm talking about. It's you know, they do it better than scholars, frankly. We should resign and become the filmmakers.
Thank you so much for the talk. On that note, I was struck in the talk too about this idea that in being transported, we're also being returned to our bodies via the spasms of texts and etc. And in that sense, in a way, returned to the etymological root of language as tongue, as opposed to communication as community, etc. So I'm wondering, there's this wonderful thought experiment you've published about waking up. I think it opens the waking up, and suddenly you don't have your feeds. If you're in the oncoming generation, you can't access your Snapchat. So the feeds aren't necessarily linguistic, right? So whereas before, you wake up, you go to your writing desk, the city could have been burning, but you might not. The world is intact. So I'm wondering if on the point of this qualitative difference, where you see language and potentially like the radicalization of language factoring in.
The radicalization of language.
I guess thinking both in the sense of language etymologically as coming from the tongue,
Mhm.
and second in the sense of language as a vocalization.
Oh, I don't know. I'm stumped by that, actually. I don't know where to think about language in relation to in relation to the kind of questions of connectivity that I was talking about at the beginning of the book.
Well, because in the talk, I thought, like, when you're talking about the ellipse as signifying a sentence, but like
I see. Yeah.
Or so I just thought that was so fascinating.
Oh yes. Okay. So if I thought you were talking about it in relation to the opening example that I had. Oh no, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on about language, and I'm not particularly a researcher of digital language itself, but there's there's firstly the return of a pictographic form is phenomenally interesting for any kind of language scholar, and the filling out, that's something that I haven't talked about. But the filling out of emojis that come from a number of different sources, but one of those sources were emoticons. So emoticons, if anyone remembers, the old pre-Windows, and even after that, texting and web, they were formed because you had a small number of symbolic characters, and they were formed by doing the brackets and the and you put the colon as the eyes, and you put a hyphen as the nose, and then you get a smiley face. And that's one of the sources for emojis. And you'd have to do that while you were typing to express emotion. So language, so the emojis themselves flesh out and fill out that initial quite schematic use of writing. And in that sense, it's very interesting. As I said, it's a return of a pictographic form. The other thing is that again, I'm not sure quite what to say about language itself. Is the strained relationship between the conversation and the archive that now occurs. And again, I'm not so much talking about spoken language here. I'm talking about writing. Writing texts, emails as well, but mainly texts, is increasingly a conversational form. It's devised for simplicity, concision, conciseness, quite often directness, humour, responsiveness. There's all sorts of issues about turn-taking in conversations which are written, which are very, very interesting, and again, new norms have to develop for that. But it's also an archive. In other words, it doesn't disappear in the way that vocalized language does, unless recorded. So it produces possibilities both for revisiting conversations which occurred in the past, and also for reinserting older conversations into new ones, both for good and for bad. That, again, has impacts on cultural memory, among other things. It also has an impact on the relationship between the past and current discourse. We talked about this briefly in the class. I mean, the ability to remind someone that they said something hurtful to you in a previous text is an unintended consequence with impact for social relations of the textual form that we would call texting or WhatsApp, and also email. So I don't think I've really answered your question, but there's clearly some interesting challenges going on in the mediation of language, in particular writing. The spoken form, I'm not expert enough to say anything I think illuminating on that, but anyway. But I took a long time saying it.
Yes, please. I think we'll take this question and one more after that.
Okay, two quick comments. One is I've seen YouTube videos that say the electromagnetic flux from these digital devices are contributing significantly to the exponential growth of chronic disease.
Right.
Not entirely, but significantly. And the other thing is, could this media be corrupted? Like Patty Chayefsky says, television has been corrupted.
Oh yeah, of course, any medium can be corrupted, but many of the claims made against Facebook around the last election here and also around Brexit in the UK are precisely about that. And there are some people with whom I would not always agree, who would say that any medium operating in a capitalist system is inherently corrupt anyway. But I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with that. But there is definitely any medium. We know that print can be corrupted. I mean, what is Mein Kampf other than a corruption, among other things, of writing and publishing? It's many other things as well, but it is that too. So, and to go to your first question, well, I don't know, and that's one of the dangers we're living with. And that could be, to go back to the question of historical contingency, we could all stop using mobile phones if someone proves unequivocally a connection between these technologies and certain diseases. If that can be proved unequivocally, and that there is no, we could see restrictions on their use for children, restrictions on their use for other populations, and perhaps restrictions on their use altogether. Either legally imposed or voluntarily adapted. So while I can't speak for what you see on YouTube, and there's plenty of stuff that's out there that's untrue and rubbish, but just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean that they're not out to get you, if you know what I mean. So who says it may be true? And that's, again, a question for historical contingency. Like the question of resources, we may run out of the resources to carry on with these developing these infrastructures, or they may prove to physically harmful to us in ways that printed texts weren't, for example. So, last question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is kind of strange and maybe broad question, but I'm wondering what the role of video games plays in your poetics and
Of what?
Video games.
Oh, okay.
Just like thinking about I feel like that's almost like common spaces where world building and also world discovering is experience, and also increasingly I have a 14-year-old brother who's very much addicted to video games, and it's not just a game, but it's also a social platform where you talk to his friends.
No, absolutely. So again, this is. I mentioned television at the end about thinking about saturation, and I mentioned the renaissance of television. Video games are a phenomenally powerful way of reimagining both. Well, for example, there are a number of questions that interest me to do with video games. The first one is connected to this idea of the mobile phone, which is embodied connection to a particular kind of interface. And a lot of the work for this was done first by scholars of video games who are very interested in what does it mean to be connected to an interface via an interactive joystick, which allows all sorts of interactions that the mouse and the trackpad and even the touch screen can only dream of being able to provide, including forms of feedback, etc. So that sense of embodied interaction with a created world is something that I think that video games have developed to an extraordinary degree. I'm not a games player, but I've seen their immersive and narrative potential. And what's very interesting there is that for some media theorists, immersion and explicit interactivity was sometimes understood to be a contradiction. So that the more immersed you were in a film or a book, the less conscious you were of it as a medium. Now that seems to be contradicted by many of the game systems that are very successful. They enable immersion and full concentration, while at the same time requiring awareness of the medium as a medium, which can be manipulated, which can be altered, in which you can take multiple views, and in which at the same time you can also engage in conversations with other players at a meta level about what you are doing. So they've challenged, they're an example of a very good object to think with, because they've challenged some previous assumptions about how forms of engagement with particular kinds of media can and should work, based on in the past on separations between modes of looking through media and modes of looking at them. And here they seem to work together in new combinations, which are very culturally interesting, aesthetically interesting.
Great, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you very much.